very fashionable these days to to criticize Wen Jiabao for not having done as much as a reformer as his rhetoric would like to suggest. It's easy to see where those criticisms come from, and I'll fill them out a bit in a minute. But, you know, if you look at China's performance over the last 10 years when he and Hu Jintao have been in charge, there have been some real achievements. The economy has grown, kept on growing, and there's been a major world financial crisis that the Chinese government has managed to negotiate its way through. GDP per capita has risen from about $1,200 US dollars per capita in 2002 to about 5,500 now. The major gap that existed in state activity in 2002 was the lack of a welfare and security net for ordinary people. And since 2005, spending on social security and welfare in China has increased at a rate that no other country has managed to match. China has become, in international terms, a country of high-profile visibility. Those of us who work in universities are truly fed up with vice-chancellors coming back from China and telling us how much the Chinese government is spending on their wonderful universities. Why aren't we doing the same in our countries? China's trains, despite the odd crash or two, are now world famous. The Expo was a great success, and so was the Olympics. There's been tremendous political stability. There's been the growth of NGO activity, which 10 years ago you wouldn't believe was possible. And there's been, of course, an amazing openness in what can be discussed in public opinion in China, not just because of social media, but generally. When I'm not at the University of Sydney, I work at Nanjing University in China. I'm on the staff there. And I'm always staggered by, in fact, I'm shocked most of the time by the comments that my colleagues come up with when we have staff meetings. I wouldn't dare say half the things they say. Sometimes I criticize them for being idealists, but that's a different issue. So I think there is a whole load of things which are positives in the last 10 years. Of course, one of the snags is to say, how far is government actually responsible for these things? Many of the things which have happened despite government, not because of it. If you haven't read a book by Victor Ni and Sandra Opper called, I can't remember the exact title, it's something like Capitalism from Below, please go away and order it on Amazon right now and read it, because it tells you that the real thrust of economic growth in China is coming not from state interaction, though state interaction obviously in the last 10 years has been quite significant, but from the bottom up, from what we would describe incorrectly as the private, small and medium sectors of the economy. We would describe it as private wrongly because, of course, there is still state involvement in that. The negatives in the last 10 years from state action are really quite obvious too. There has been a tremendous growth of cynicism in Chinese politics by Chinese people. The Bo Xilai case earlier this year, really brought this totally to the surface. Most people that I know in China do not only believe that Bo Xilai was guilty of anything, or his wife for that matter, they even say things like, Hayward? There really was a person called Hayward? How could you be so naive as to believe that? They believe the whole story is fabricated out of the minds of the Chinese Communist Party. There has been a lack of political reform. There has been a lack of political leadership in reform in China in the last 10 years, which has been quite staggering. The state has grown. All the issues that the state should have been involved in, that were on the agenda 10 years ago, have not been implemented. There's been a lot of talk of the development of consumer society. Ideology caught up very quickly with the need for a development of a consumer society. 10 years ago, you could not talk about, in China, the middle class. The phrase wouldn't pass people's lips. People were frightened to mention the middle class. Now the state has embraced it. Everything has to be the middle class, and the middle class depends on the development of a consumer society. But is it possible that a consumer society is actually emerging in China? No. Spending on consumption now is less than it was 10 years ago. Savings have gone up. Why? Because there is no safety net, there is no welfare state. Despite the fact that in 2005 the state started spending more money on welfare, it is inadequate. And people know that, and they have to save. There remains uncertainty about the rule of law. In 2006, 2008, bankruptcy laws were introduced, privacy laws were introduced, but people still don't know the basis on which they really own property, or indeed if they own it at all. People buy houses and find that they don't buy houses. I live in a building in Taiyuan, which is an illegal building. That is to say, it exists, but it was built by a village on their land without permission. This means a number of things. It doesn't mean that the police don't look after us. I'm the only foreigner in the village, so they know who I am. I kind of stick out a bit. But it means that the postal services can't deliver me a letter, and I can't get TV cable because I'm in an illegal building. Who owns my flat? I don't own it, by the way. I rent it. I rent it from a landlord, somebody who sells it to me. Does he own the flat? He thinks he owns the flat, and for the time that he's getting the money for the rent, he certainly owns the flat. But when somebody decides that that building is going to come down, for whatever reason, he probably will get no compensation. So that kind of ownership situation is very, very strange. And then the most important negative out of all this is the growth in inequality, the tremendous growth in inequality. In 2002, the Gini coefficient was something like 0.447 for China as a whole. It's now 0.516. That is a tremendous rise.
Sorry, what is it now?
0.516. 2011 in 2000. But the Gini coefficient is nothing. Those of you with any knowledge of stats and economics will know it's a measure of income inequality, and it's a nice figure to trot out because policy wonks like to tell you that at 0.400, that's when countries become unstable. Well, that's very interesting. But much more interesting is the rise in inequality between urban and rural China. Of course, everybody has grown over this 10 years period, but the growth in the ratio between urban and rural China has gone from 2.5 to 3. In other words, there's been an almost 20% growth in inequality, in the distance between rural and urban inequality over that 10-year period. That is quite staggering. And of course, it shows in wealth. These days in China, the top 10% of the population own 86% of the wealth. Where does this leave us at the end of the Wen Jiabao period then? So in economics, it leaves us in a situation where we have a society, an economy, where growth is possible, but not guaranteed. The real choice is between developing a consumer society by creating welfare or by developing a predatory state like Mexico. And the balance between those two is quite acute. In social terms, there has been a tremendous transformation in the working class. The old working class has gone. A new working class based on migrant labours has come. And there is a growing middle class, but the middle class is not big. The middle class is no more, at the very most, than about 6 to 8% of the total population. People who earn something like more than 60,000, the equivalent of 60,000 American dollars a year. But there is, as I said before, growing inequality and so on. And in political terms, clearly we have a liberalising authoritarian regime. But it's not one that is likely to go the whole way towards liberalisation. The notion of a democratic moment in China is, I think, rather remote for the next 10 years. If we step back and ask ourselves how it might happen that there was a democratic moment in China, I think we have two extreme views of the possibilities. One is economic collapse, economic downturn, severe economic downturn, leading to collapse. The other is that the leadership would seize the nettle and go in for some kind of democratic moment itself. It's certainly the case that it's discussed that. But the notion of collapse is unlikely to happen, and the notion of the leadership taking the grip and going forward is even more unlikely. As I say, economic slowdown is not collapse, And there is a big enough market in China to support the collapse of international trade, which of course China does depend on. So why would the leadership adopt democratic change, or indeed any form of radical change for that matter? Well, the answer is because they know that if they did, they would have some way of ensuring the continuation of Communist Party rule for a longer-term future. But, and this is really the big but, it's the same about the development of consumer society, the development of welfare, the development of things that Wen Jiabao should have done over the last 10 years. The current leadership really lacks the political imagination, as well as the political stimulus, the need to go down the track of greater reform. They may, like Wen Jiabao, all of them, find themselves intellectually attracted by the idea of reform. But the organisation they exist in, the Communist Party and its organisation department and all that, essentially means that they are unable to deliver on the reforms they need to justify their own future existence.